So thank you all for tuning in. This is the IEO Webinar Series, and I am Nicoletta Batini, IEO Lead Evaluator, your webinar coordinator and moderator today. Today we focus on multilateralism with a webinar discussing a proposal for a joint reform of the IMF and the WTO. It is widely recognized that multilateralism has helped craft the post-Cold War globalized world order and has been pivotal in helping prevent major international wars. Today, however, not all is well with multilateralism, as we know, and the reasons of this crisis are different, but most commonly mentioned factors include geopolitical rivalries and possibly the failure of the post-World War II economic and political system to deal with emerging global challenges like constraints on planetary resources, the asymmetric drivers and impacts of climate change, and of course, ever-increasing global and national income inequality. There's also a fear that the global institutions like the United Nations, the WHO, WTO, NATO, EU, etc., seek to rise above the authority of the nation state in order to determine their own policies. The Pandemic Response Agenda 2030 and proposals to extend emergency powers of these institutions following this events or in light of these goals are often indicated as examples of this fear and possibilities. So what can be done to restore legitimacy in global governance? In this webinar, Hector Torres, CIGI, formerly IMF and WTO, will present a proposal to strengthen multilateralism by reforming simultaneously the IMF and the WTO, the institutions responsible for liberalizing trade and for regulating capital movements. Let me tell you a word about Hector Torres, which you may know already, for those who don't. Hector is currently Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, Canada, and is Visiting Professor at Di Tella University in Buenos Aires. He was formerly an IMF Executive Director for Argentina and alternate Director for Brazil. And he also worked for many years at the World Trade Organization, including during the financial crisis, and more recently as a counselor in the Economic Research and Statistics Division. Rafiq Dossani is also with us. His RAND Corporation, Part D RAND Graduate School as well, will examine these and other reforms that may be needed to restore a world order at a time when two great powers, the United States and China, seem to have different views, making the outcome hard to predict. A couple of words on Rafiq, who again, many might know. Rafiq is currently director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy, a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, and a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He works on education, finance, regional development, security, trade, and technology issues. Recent research by Rafiq includes studies of China's grand strategy and its use of institutions, security in the Korean Peninsula, the Belt and Road Initiative, track to diplomacy between the United States and China, and Asia's democratization. Previously, Rafiq was director of Stanford University Center for South Asia and a senior research scholar at Stanford University Institute for International Studies. Ground rules: we will collect questions in the chat during the event and in person at the end of the two presentations. Please, again, mute yourself when you're not speaking. Again, this meeting is recorded. Let's start. Hector, you have written about the idea of a joint reform of the IMF and the WTO to revamp, relegitimize multilaterally driven world order. And I'll leave you the floor so you can tell us a little bit more about it. Thank you, Hector. You can start sharing your slides now.
Thank you for inviting. Let me see if I share this. A few slides that I want to share with you. Let me see if I can put this right. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting. I'm very proud to be speaking at the IEO and to have such a well-known and reputed commentator. I will illustrate some of the points with some slides, but basically the slides are going to be short. Let's start by what everybody knows, which is globalization and what globalization has brought to the world. Globalization increased, of course, economic output and boosted technological innovation. There's no question about that. But it has also deepened distributional tensions and failed to accommodate some social preferences and stem environmental degradation. A sense of inequality, of being left behind, grew in many countries, mostly in Western countries, a sentiment that was compounded by the great financial crisis, in which taxpayers' money had to be used to bail out banks and bankers. Now, these drawbacks were compounded by the COVID pandemic, when many governments scrambled to repress exports of vaccines and sanitary equipment. I would say a protect family first, very instinctive and natural, understandable reaction, but it bode ill with globalization. It called into question the reliability of economic interdependence. And then the resilience logic, the just-in-case logic, started to trump over the geoeconomic logic. Long value chains started being seen as a source of vulnerability. Economic considerations were replaced by the just-in-case logic. Inshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring value chains were proposed, or are being proposed, as means to build up resilience. Russia's invasion and the sanctions that followed, the weaponization of the clearing payment mechanisms, and China's no limits partnerships with Russia pushed national security concerns to the top of the political agenda. Economic nationalism is rising, and trust in multilateral institutions is fading. We are moving, to put it in a nutshell, from geoeconomics to geopolitics. The United States is promoting a China-less Indo-Pacific economic framework, and China is proposing an American-less global security initiative. Each camp is advancing preferential trade agreements and investment areas, and each camp is underpinning them with a web of swap agreements. This, of course, will entrench the fracture of the world. It could not be otherwise. And two or more competitive institutional frameworks may emerge, each with its own set of rules, which may be incompatible, even hostile rules. This undermines, of course, the two multilateral institutions that are responsible for promoting trade liberalization and for preserving the multilateral payment of systems that makes trade possible. These are, of course, the WTO and the IMF. Admittedly, trust, as I said, on multilateral institutions, on their effectiveness, is running thin. And to buttress this trust, what I will argue is that both institutions need to be updated. Admittedly, the WTO has been running short of trust and effectiveness has been questioned, to put it diplomatically, for quite a long time. And this, the WTO is loaded with problems. I will refer to a few of them, but I will delve only in one of them. And needs definitely more profound repairs than what the IMF needs. Now, this should not come to a surprise to anybody because the WTO has no independent watchdog, no independent evaluation office, hence no institutional learning culture. It has been much easier to sweep problems under the rug in Geneva than in Washington. Its dispute settlement, this is one of the jewels of the crown that WTO had, is blocked. It's blocked because in 2017, the United States, President Trump more concretely, decided to block the selection of new appellate body members. So now, when you bring a dispute to the WTO, a panel is created, as it had to be, as it always is. If the panel issues a recommendation, ruling, if you want to put it in that terms, but if one of the country that loses that dispute considers that it doesn't want to comply with the recommendation, it just can appeal that and it sends the dispute into the void. So that's blocked. It takes decision by consensus. There's hardly any votes, and I believe for very good reasons. I'm not proposing voting, but the consensus in the WTO is interpreted as unanimity. And frequently, very frequently, it is abused just to gain leverage in negotiations. Then another big problem is that its rules on subsidies were designed for a world that is quite different from the current world. The world for which these rules were designed was a world in which trade was mostly carried out by private businesses, and the governments had very little influence in corporate decisions. In sum, the WTO has many problems. But in this chat, I will limit myself to speaking about an update, a problem that needs to be addressed, and I would say updated, and that fixing it matches very well, symmetrically, with an update that the IMF badly needs. These two updates would not require any kind of new Bretton Woods moment. It is not about a revolution. It is about implementing incremental updates or reforms, if you want, that could be calibrated so that the two competing camps, say that camp led by the United States and the camp led by China, could harvest roughly equivalent benefits. This is the point that I will address now, and I will explain, is the WTO has 164 members. About 2/3 of these members claim to be in a developing stage. They are developing countries. And therefore, they're entitled to something that at the WTO is called special and differential treatment. Now, what is this differential treatment? This special treatment is meant to provide longer periods to introduce less ambitious tariff reductions. Now, imposing lighter obligations on countries, on developing countries that used to have fewer fiscal resources made a lot of sense. Because opening markets can send uncompetitive industries out of business. And this happens much faster than what the economy can, than the economy's capacity to reabsorb the labor and the capital. And obviously, nobody wins too much if you close uncompetitive industries and you send people to unemployment. So countries with fiscal space could cushion or can cushion the transit. Traditionally, developing countries didn't have this fiscal space, the fiscal resources, or at least much less than what their developed partners could have had. Now, this was the situation in the 60s and the 70s. So it was justified. But nowadays, many large emerging market economies, and when I'm speaking about large emerging market economies, I have in mind those that are sitting at the G20, have fiscal space, and frequently more fiscal space than some cash-strained, supposedly rich countries or advanced economies, as you call them, we call them at the IMF. Moreover, large emerging market economies have developed very competitive export industries. However, as the WTO has no objective criteria to say when a country is developing, or let's put it less I would say, easier to grasp, when a country needs, cannot compete on an equal footing in the marketplace, so it needs this extra policy space, there's no criteria. So, and nobody feels compelled to develop. At the WTO, no country ever develops because it's so much comfortable to say, stay developing forever. So nobody gives up the special and differential crutch, I would say. Developed countries, of course, are quite unhappy with this. And they have been trying unsuccessfully to persuade large emerging markets to undertake full responsibilities. This is trade responsibilities equivalent to the ones that developed countries take. But they failed, as I said. Now, not surprisingly, this affects trust in the WTO capacity to host successful trade negotiations. Trade negotiations, not by surprise, move away from the WTO more and more. And as a reaction also, developed countries, out of that frustration, they do their utmost with quite success to water down the special and differential treatment. So as a consequence, trade negotiations move elsewhere, and the truly disadvantaged countries, the really developing countries, least developed than some others, that do need the special treatment, don't get much of the benefits. I mean, the benefits watered down. Everybody loses. Everybody loses. That's the truth. So this is dysfunctional practices and obsolete rules at the WTO. That's the WTO situation. Now let me move to the IMF, which is more familiar for most of those that are hearing this seminar. At the IMF, curiously, the narrative is symmetrically opposite. The same large emerging markets that at the WTO argue that they need this differential treatment because they are not ready to compete on an equal footing with the developed partners, these same group of countries at the IMF are struggling precisely to be able to undertake more responsibilities, meaning pay larger quotas and have more responsibilities in conducting the IMF. What they are arguing is our weight in the world economy has outgrown our quotas. We are grown up, we are equals, we want to undertake more responsibilities. Now, who's preventing this from happening? Well, in the IMF, it is the advanced economies, the same developed countries in the WTO jargon, that at the WTO argue that large emerging market economies must assume full responsibilities. These same developed countries are the ones that are preventing the large emerging markets at the IMF from raising their quotas to levels that are proportional to the real weight in the world economy. I could live this personally because I repeatedly moved back and forth from the WTO to the IMF board 3 times. And I could experience this. I found it almost schizophrenic, as if trade ministers and finance ministers never talked to each other. Now, the fund, as you know, reviews its quotas every 5 years. Each quota review, is an opportunity to increase IMF genuine resources, quotas, and of course redistribute relative quota shares in favor of the most dynamic economies, which are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly large emerging market economies. There have been some quota increases. The last was in 2010, as you know, implemented only 6 years after. But since then, there has been no progress. And as you can see in this slide that you have in front of you, where the surface of the countries is represented by their IMF quotas, meaning if you see this, this is China, this is India, the surface is equivalent to the IMF quotas. So what you see in this map, in the world seen from the IMF quotas, is that the IMF is very much still a North Atlantic driven organization. Asia is conspicuously underrepresented at the IMF. These are the 3, I put 10 biggest economies, 10 biggest economies there. You see China, 19.3% of world GDP in terms of PPP, quota 6.41, India almost 8% of world GDP, the fastest growing economy in the world now, 2.76%, and Indonesia, I picked up the third example, is 263 of the world GDP and only 0.98 of the IMF quotas. Now, this means that Asia is conspicuously underrepresented. China, India, and Indonesia have quotas that only represent a small fraction of their share in world output. And I would say, of course, I don't ignore that IMF quota is not just about output. I will come back to that. But I would argue that vis-a-vis their weight in the world economy, they are the most underrepresented emerging markets. And curiously, and this is important to bear in mind, China and India are, no question, WTO largest developing countries. And it would be totally politically impossible to reform special and differential treatment, meaning to get large emerging markets economies to accept that they are equals in, they have to be assuming equal obligations at the WTO. If you want WTO to prosper as an arena for future negotiations, if you don't convince India and China, which of course resist. Persuading them to accept full trade responsibilities may depend on their capacity to get fairer representation at the other side of the Atlantic. Now, getting this straight is very important, not just for the WTO, also for the fund. As it has been so difficult to persuade advanced economies to agree on a new quota formula that would give more weight to economic output, let alone agree on quota increases, most IMF capital now doesn't come from quotas. It depends on loans. It depends on loans. Now, does it matter? Is it important that it depends on loans? Well, yes, it does. I will explain this in 2 reasons. First, because it undermines the IMF legitimacy, as loans don't provide voting rights. But it also weakens the fund. Loans, as the new agreements to borrow, are only available if they are previously activated. This implies that every 6 months or less, the managing director, the IMF managing director, must consult with lenders, negotiate with the main lenders, to be honest, to get their approval for the activation. As the new agreements to borrow can only be activated with the support of 85% of the total credit arrangements. Now, who has more than 15% of the total credit arrangements right now? It's not just the United States. It's also the EU, it is Japan, and it's the BRICS, if they act together. If they act together. All these 4 countries or group of countries could block or condition the activation of the new agreements to borrow. It hasn't happened so far, although I remember when I was sitting at the chair of Brazil, there was a lot of talk about this. But in a fragmented world, it is not unimaginable. In sum, the fund is no longer a quota-based institution. It must pass the hat around. And in a fractured world, it may have to persuade or compete with other hats, perhaps with Asian hats. Now, can we do something about this? Can we get it straight? Moving from a rules-based order into a deals-based order, as we are seeing now, would entrench geopolitical fragmentation, and it would endanger international peace. So it's worth trying, despite that's going to be difficult, and I will address this now. If we want to preserve an economically integrated world, trust in the IMF and the WTO must be reinforced. For that, both institutions need to be reconciled with reality, because both institutions have been overtaken by economic developments that shaped a different world from the one where they were originally conceived. They must be updated. Now, at the IMF, advanced economies should allow for quota increases for the most dynamic economies, and prominently from India and China. This would reinforce the IMF's capital. It would prop IMF legitimacy as a truly universal institution. On the other side of the Atlantic, large emerging market economies, prominently China and India, should be ready to assume full trade responsibilities and cooperate in ensuring that special and differential treatment provides tangible benefits to those countries that need it most. Symmetrical reforms are necessary to balance the deal, because neither WTO's agenda nor IMF's agenda are broad enough to ensure a balanced deal for competing geopolitical camps in this fractured and mistrusting world. In a nutshell, it's fairer IMF representation to reinforce IMF legitimacy, strengthen its lending function, and make it politically feasible for large emerging markets to assume full trade responsibilities at the WTO. So putting this straight, having, I would say, you cannot be a kitty in Washington and a lion, pretend to be a lion a kitty in Geneva and pretend to be a lion in Washington. Putting this thing straight would breathe new hope of multilateralism. Now, could it be done? Well, it will be complex. At the WTO, basically for a logistical problem, at the WTO, trade ministers cannot undertake commitments for their peers sitting at the IMF Board of Governors. And conversely, at the IMF, finance ministers and central bank governors cannot commit for reforms that must be approved by their peers sitting at WTO ministerial meetings. So it will require a lot of diplomacy. It will be complex. It will be easy. It will be difficult. Sorry, I didn't say, I meant difficult. Sorry. Now, it should start where? Not at the WTO, not at the IMF. The only place where this could start is at the G20. The G20's membership is narrower than the IMF's and the WTO's, but its members account for 90% of the world GDP, 80% of trade, 2/3 of the world's population. And the IMF's and MD and the WTO's DG are regularly invited to brief the heads of state in the meetings. And indeed, I heard from the DG of the WTO that she was concretely invited by President Macron to bring the issues that are stopping WTO reform and affecting WTO effectiveness to the attention of the chiefs of state, because she understood that fixing this goes beyond the capacity of trade ministers. Now, naturally, the chiefs of government are not going to enter into the technicalities, but they could advance guidelines to be carried out by finance and trade ministers in their respective meetings. Now, we are lucky to have two daring ladies at the helm of the WTO and the IMF. Both, I believe, are ready to walk the extra mile. Both come from, have experience in DC's 19th Street, so they look at these problems from the same angle. And both are used to rub shoulders with policymakers. They are not just ambassadors in WTO, as we had previous DG at the WTO. These are policymakers. So if they dare to do it, and they use a lot of diplomacy, and they have a lot of skills to do it, I think they could start and kick that ball, bringing it to the attention of the G20 chiefs of state. I'm quite optimistic on this possibility. So that's my presentation, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Hector. This was very thoughtful and convincing proposal, I thought. And but I would really like Rafiq Dossani to present his thoughts and slides about these issues and share them with us now. Rafiq, I will share it for you because we said it wasn't working.
Yeah, thanks, Nicoletta, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I really enjoyed Hector's presentation, and it certainly raised a lot of food for thought that I'll comment on a little later.
Can everybody see? Can you see it, Rafiq? Can everybody see the slides?
I can.
Okay, so just let me know. Tell me next slide. And we're on the first slide, of course.
So my presentation, what Nicoletta said, asked me to do was give a perspective on how US-China rivalry might affect the future of multilateralism, and in the context of Hector's presentation, to provide some thoughts about his specific proposal. So I'll come to that later. But let's start with sort of a broad view of multilateralism. Next slide, please. So I put a definition, although all of you would be familiar with this. I just wanted to make sure that it was understood that when I say the word use multilateralism, doesn't mean global multilateralism. It can be any kind of multilateralism that involves separate countries. Some multilateral institutions are global, some are more selective, some base their selection on member preferences, some have member preferences plus additional criteria. For example, ASEAN has a geographical criterion. OPEC has a functional criterion, but both of them require new membership to be based on member preferences. So that's how institutions are generally organized. Now, the next slide, please. Next. Now, reforming a body on its own and I'll come to Hector's idea of a grand bargain later, is all, oh, go back please, yeah, that is always difficult. One is the reforms may lead to losses for some members, which makes decisions by consensus difficult, as we've seen in the case of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, and the WTO. To avoid such a situation, in many cases, promoter interests are embedded in the rules. For example, voting rights might be set, and you can't change them easily. But of course, as we have seen in the case of the IMF, that can hamper reforms as well. Now, what I'm trying to say is that you have multilateral institutions with many different kinds of structures, but you still can have progress. What we have seen historically is that when one great power is dominant, these other factors can somehow be managed. And that great power that was dominant in the post-World War II period, and for several decades since, is the United States. It promoted several multilateral institutions, including those run by consensus that have been successful. Next slide, please. Now, what gave the US that ability to do that, it had the capacity to underwrite success because since the 1890s, it's been the world's largest economy and military power. By 1945, when these institutions were mostly promoted, the US was the world's largest exporter, accounting for a third of global exports. Interestingly, by contrast, China's current share of global goods exports is 13%. So if you look at the list of institutions here, the World Bank, IMF, and so on, what you see is that they were 5 years around the world after World War II, mostly. Some of them were allowed for control with the rules. For example, the veto power given to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the voting rights in the World Bank and the IMF. But most you see are not based on rules-based control. They're consensus-driven organizations. And so I'll come in the next slide, but before you go to that, I do want to point out that subsequent to the immediate post-war period, when new needs arose, new institutions were promoted. For example, the World Food Program in 1961, United Nations Environment Program in 1972. Next slide, please. So, I spoke about one dominant player, but there was another, the Soviet Union. And it wasn't a happy relationship, obviously, when they both met within the institutions. And we saw that in the way the Security Council has functioned over the last, since it was formed. But wherever possible, the US tried to manage the situation in its own interests and perhaps believing that it was in the greater public good. So the US provided sustained leadership and financial support through this period and these were key ingredients. The US did it because it saw the institutions essential to the Cold War. But there were challenges, for example, USSR, Soviet Union, and its Warsaw Pact countries challenged several of the institutions. The US response was to try and exclude those institutions from exclude the Warsaw Pact countries from joining these institutions. For example, you can see some names here, the FAO, the IMF, UNESCO, WHO, World Bank. A second challenging group was the non-aligned movement, which opposed the US in many multilateral forums. But really, it lacked the resources and unified leadership to be an effective challenger. China could have been a challenger. It has a long commitment to the global South. Large number of countries support it, but it was excluded from the UN until 1971, from the IMF and World Bank till 1980. Even GATT, where it was, in its earlier form as the Republic of China, was a founding member. It was excluded, and then when it wanted to rejoin the GATT and WTO, it took 15 years, from 1986 to 2001. In fact, the most effective challengers to the global institutions have been regional powers. sometimes acting together, sometimes individually. I give two examples: the Inter-American Bank, which was the forerunner of the Inter-American Development Bank, was proposed in 1940 but blocked by the US Congress. Actually, it was only formed in 1959 with strong US control. And that too was in response to a parallel move that the United States was planning in the Middle East, where it wanted to set up the Arab Development Bank, which never happened, and was being criticized for not looking after its backyard. And it sort of reluctantly agreed to the IADB. Second example, Japan tried and failed twice, in 1956 and 1962, to create an Asian regional bank, again due to US opposition. Again, only in 1965, when the US had entered the war in Vietnam and looked at Southeast Asia as an important place to control communism, was the US then open to the bank being formed. That too with control shared between the US and Japan. And interestingly, the headquarters of ADB was moved from its original plan of being in Tokyo to Manila. So in summary, on this point, I would argue that US actions in its self-interest protected the existing multilateral institutions of ownership conflict, and it worked because the US was such a dominant player. Next slide. I would argue that the best time for multilateralism actually coincided with the period when the US was a unipolar global power. After the Cold War ended for about a decade, multilateralism had several successes. I've given several examples here, mostly in the national security area and the diplomatic and military areas, not economic. Most of them, the UN Security Council's pivotal role in resolving the Balkan conflicts, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency's role in implementing the agreed framework on denuclearizing North Korea. It was successful up to a point, obviously, not completely and permanently. The establishment of the WTO in 1995 and China's entry in 2001, the World Health Organization's management of the SARS pandemic of 2003. And notably, the US was a sponsor of all these initiatives. So if one summarizes the post-war period up to 2000, institutions do seem to have performed better when they accepted the leadership of one country than when they try to accommodate the views of their members, which is kind of ironic. Next slide. Now, from 2000 or this century, the US's commitment to multilateralism has wavered somewhat. It started really with not to do with a resurgent China. It began with differences in Iraq over the Iraq War in 2002 in the Security Council. Having failed to gain approval at the Security Council to authorize the invasion of Iraq due to French and Russian opposition, the United States created an ad hoc coalition of the willing for the purpose. This was a move where it was, interestingly, a formal institution, which was global, the United Nations, not being used by the US, and it created an informal coalition of willing partners to undertake the job. In 2013, the same happened when the US failed to gain approval for a military strike on Syria, and once again created an ad hoc coalition. Under President Trump, the shift to away from multilateralism was accelerated, withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, UNESCO, UNHRC, and WHO, and focusing more on bilateral and minilateral agreements. Minilateral is a special term. It's not necessarily a subset of multilateral. It's a group of countries that agree to do something together, but it's not formal. It might be disbanded after that. The Biden administration brought the US back to 3 of the 4 institutions it had left. But like Trump, it has probably spent more time on minilateral arrangements, such as the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and AUKUS. The problem with these initiatives compared with the earlier ones, where the US provided not just support, but significant financial support, is that Biden's new initiatives do not have that feature. What we see, for example, is that the US is the largest defaulter in IPCC commitments to developing countries. The IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, focuses on standards and avoids trade liberalization. The Partnership for Global Investment in Infrastructure, launched earlier this year, lacks credible resource commitments. So the sustainability of these institutions is a question mark. And what, next slide, please. By contrast, China shows a rising commitment to multilateralism. Not only does it actively participate in existing multilateral institutions, it has promoted several of its own, mostly regional institutions and initiatives, many of which compete with US-promoted multilateral institutions through adequate resource commitments. The most obvious example of the number that up that table would be the Belt and Road Initiative, as a result of which China, the BRI, has overtaken the World Bank in terms of the size of its financing. And what this table shows are the key Chinese initiatives of this century and where they are located. You can see the Asia focus coming out, but it's not just Asia. China is looking widely. So that's kind of interesting, a situation where China's commitment is rising and the US's is unsteady and not properly resourced. Next slide. And this all in the context where China-US relations have significantly worsened. I just, to illustrate this, I just take two years, 2013, 2021, to show the change between the two. We have here a quote of 2013 from Secretary of State Kerry, saying the United States wants a strong, normal, but special relationship with China. And that's a special, that's Kerry's standard of English, unfortunately, because China is a great power with a great ability to affect events in the world. And we need to work together to do that. And Wang Yi says, who's also the foreign minister now, China-US relations must adhere to the principles of no conflict or confrontation, mutual respect, win-win cooperation. We are aware of the US statement that it does not see China as a threat or intend to contain China. Instead, it wishes to see a strong and stable China. And then some years later, Foreign Secretary Blinken saying that the US approach to China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. And Wang Yi, after repeating his earlier mantra of 2013, adds, the US side defines China-US relations as having competitive, cooperative, and adversarial aspects. Our view is that it blurs the distinction between the mainstream and substream of the bilateral relations and reflects the lack of a clear direction and goal going forward. So this is just meant to illustrate how bad this situation is. And there's no reason to expect it to get any better. In fact, all the moves of the Biden administration suggest it's going to get even worse. And China's response, of course. Next slide. So here, this is my last slide, and then I'll use this slide to segue a bit into talking about Hector's thesis or proposal. So instead of a state of China-US relations that is, in Blinken's words, competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be, the current state of China-US relations is better described as adversarial when it can be, collaborative when it must be, and competitive when it needn't be. An example being, say, like semiconductors. There's no reason for the CHIPS Act other than to contain China in that particular industry. So it's adversarial only because the US is ahead in technology to make this possible, but it's not something that's necessary. Collaborative, and it must be, the climate change is probably the best example of that, where both sides recognize the importance of working together, although that temporarily is suspended. And competitive when it needn't be. And there's no reason for the US and China to compete on, say, providing healthcare, public healthcare support to China, to African countries. It increases costs and makes outcomes more difficult to achieve. As far as multilateral institutions they're likely to see all three situations, as the US now under Biden shows a renewed interest in multilateralism. China's capacity, we should recognize, is rising and steady, but it is still significantly below the US in almost any sense one can think about. So will multilateralism survive this situation? I would argue that different types of institutions will see different outcomes. For those that are run by consensus, it's going to be very difficult. For those that are run by majority votes, there will be the sort of tensions we see in the IMF, or pre-established rights, the same situation. And the result could be exits and setting up of competitive institutions, which we are already observing. And this could continue causing once powerful institutions to lose relevance. For example, APEC at one time was a powerful institution. Since then, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum is what I mean. Since then, it's lost quite a bit of its relevance. So summarizing the first 2 decades of the century, the new bipolar world order has not led to institutions that are jointly and sustainably managed by the two great powers. The only example of success that we are seeing is China-US collaboration on climate change prior to the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. It suggests that collaboration is possible, even if it takes an existential threat to the planet to give meaning to the words when it must be, collaborate when it must be, which is a sad commentary on the state of the world today. So turning now to Hector's proposal for, I mean, it's hard to disagree. I think it's an excellent idea. The question I would raise is that the countries, the developed Western countries, are being asked to give up their rights in a situation where they have control in return for, in the WTO, where they do not have control, to gain some rights. And the question is whether they would view that as an equal bargain or a fair bargain. Because once those rights are changed, they're changed, with some permanency. Whereas where you have consensus-driven organizations like the WTO, those changes can be temporary. But maybe there's a way to the special and differential treatment to make those permanent and embed some of these interests in permanence. The second question, second comment I would have is many of these institutions have structural problems. It's just happened to be the case that there was one superpower for many, many decades, and the institutions worked well. Now what's happening is that the world is becoming increasingly bipolar in its power structure, and one would expect the institutions to feel the strains of that. And so I'm not that optimistic on the achievability of such a grand bargain, but I think the idea certainly worth pursuing. There might be other instances of institutions which both have similar organization structures, both consensus-driven, where a grand bargain may be more feasible. Those are my comments. Thank you. Back to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you very much, Rafiq. Your tour d'horizon on the state of affairs on multilateralism, I think, was extremely insightful. And I really share your conclusions. I would like to go back to Hector for some thoughts on what Rafiq just said, and then maybe we can open the Q&A for 10 minutes or so. So Hector, do you have any just off the bat reactions to Rafiq? Maybe should I call it disillusion with the possibility that there'll be a lot of progress quickly on your proposal, or any other thoughts about his slides?
Well, I don't, thank you, and thank you, Rafiq, for those comments, very pertinent, those questions, the vast questions. I don't believe there's going to be any kind of fast progress. This is going to be difficult and complex. And I'm not even extremely optimistic. I just believe that the main problem is that we don't have leadership here. And the closest leadership that we could have, I think, put this forth to the consideration of the heads of government is from the heads of both organizations. So I'm not extremely optimistic, but I believe that this is the first step for a series of reform. You have to kickstart. The WTO is dying. Let's put it this way. If we move into a deals-based world, a world in which you have preferential agreements between friends, neighbors, well, first of all, we have two problems. That world doesn't bother with the technological progresses. And let me put it this way. Those that imagine that we could replace multilateral trade agreements with regional trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, preferential trade agreements in general, are thinking about trade in goods or goods and the related services. And that is possible, it was possible when most of the trade or all of the trade was about exchanging things that have a discrete existence. A good is composed by atoms. Atoms can be at only one place at the time. So you, with difficulty, using rules of origin, you can determine where a good is coming from. Is it coming from a partner of your preferential trade agreement? It gets a lower tariff or a better regulation, better access. If it doesn't, well, then it doesn't get into the market, or it has to pay a very high price to get into the market. Rules of origin are made for trade in atoms. Now, what's growing most is exchanges of digital flows. Digital flows don't have a discrete existence. They behave like waves. They can be stored at n places at almost zero marginal cost, reproduced with n times, and delivered from many times, from many places at the same time. There's no way you can apply rules of origin. And if there's no way you can apply rules of origin, there's no way you can move into a world of preferential trade agreements that would replace the multilateral basis of set of rules. Unless, of course, you fracture the world in such a definite way in which you can put firewalls and the state can control almost everything, anything that flows digitally into your borders, which is an Orwellian world. Of course, it's possible. I'm not saying it's not possible, but that's certainly not the world we want to go. And I believe it's not the world that leaders, even this second-class leaders we have right now, sorry to say that, would want. So it's worth trying. Now, what I know, what I see is that the WTO's agenda is extremely narrow. You will not get a balanced deal out of that. And trade ministers are always horse trading. And they have a very narrow view. They just want to know what are the beans they get in exchange for other beans, and that's about it. And I don't see why large emerging markets, let's say China, India, concretely, the fastest growing economies in the world, would be accepting to give up a right they have at the WTO if they don't get something in exchange. And they cannot get anything in exchange at the WTO, because whatever they get in exchange at the WTO will be extremely costly for the developed economies. Now, you tell me, and you're right, that developed countries are currently controlling the IMF. They manage the IMF. So why would they give up something that they currently control in exchange for something that is just so obvious that China and India are ready to compete on an equal footing, at least in certain industries? Say nobody would discuss that China is very competitive in manufacturing, or that India is very competitive in IT services, or that Brazil is very competitive in agriculture, same as Argentina. And so you have all that. So The point is that the IMF, as I try to suggest, the IMF is not in good shape either if it depends on loans, and loans that will come in a fractured world in which you have more and more polarization in the world. So I wouldn't say that, yes, they control something. They control something that still looks like a North Atlantic organization when Asia is growing much faster, and when you add the geopolitical problem. So if you look at it with a little bit of, if we had a leader, and unfortunately we don't have it, at least I don't know it or her, with a strategic vision, I'm sure that leader would say, yeah, maybe we control the IMF now, but I'm not very sure how long we're going to be controlling this IMF. And this IMF will be universal, let alone if Trump comes back to America's government. And as you know, the political, I would say, basis he has are not extremely fond of multilateral institutions. They would far prefer bilateral agreements. So look, all what you say is very correct, is very depressing. I have nothing better to offer, but I say this is worth trying.
Thank you, Hector. We have a question in the chat, but before we go to Diego, I would like to ask you to ask a question in person. I have there's another long question. Okay, coming up. 2, 3, 4, 2 questions. I have a question myself, so I want to look at the problem from a different angle. And the question is, well, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since these institutions have been formed. The world has become, multi-power. And now some argue we're on the verge of a Bretton Woods 3 with the sunsetting of the dollar as the dominant currency, and a fragmentation between the West and the East that had never been seen before, not even during the Cold War, in part related to COVID, but in part, and the origin of this, and in part related to of course, the war of Russia in Ukraine, and the sanctions that came afterwards, which created this very uncomfortable geopolitical environment. So the question is, and for both of you, I think, does Asia, so the Asia that has been ignored in Hector's slides, but that also has been able to create successful and well-funded regional initiatives in Rafiq's slides, really need the IMF. So what would happen if, instead of reforming and empowering these institutions, the WTO, fell into complete disrepair, and the IMF saw progressive withdrawal of the contribution and presence of Asia, and particularly these large countries, which at some point might even think that it's not worth to be part of something where they can be sufficiently represented. Is that a possibility? Of course, I guess a lot of people in the West think, oh, maybe we can kick out this country, or maybe we'll always keep them at a low quota so they won't. But might they have interest to withdraw? And what would happen if is that something that the West should fear?
Hector, would you like to go first?
Yes, please.
You want look, it is something to fear, there's no question. Right now, I don't see signs of Asia decoupling from the WTO, from the IMF yet. Indeed, if you look at the Chiang Mai initiative, which is the most advanced and sophisticated regional financial arrangement, they even have a small office of research, but they basically free ride on IMF's capacity to design programs and monitor conditionality. There's a first tranche that Chiang Mai members can get without an IMF program, but afterwards is the IMF program. So I would say it's Chiang Mai money with IMF conditionality and IMF monitoring of compliance with conditionality. And the same could be said for other regional financial arrangements. So I don't see that is yet happening. Now, the fact that if Asia doesn't get a fair representation at the IMF, it's hard for me to say that they would accept this all the time. More and more, it would be more and more, I would say, absurd if you have an Asia growing at 6-7% as India is growing, China will be growing at 5%, and you have a recession in the West. That map that I showed, that was made a few years ago, thanks to the G24, and I'm sure that map already looks worse than that. It is simply a matter of time. I mean, how far can the political power of the North Atlantic organizations, I mean, the North Atlantic countries, including Japan, can ignore the reality that growth and is coming from somewhere else. And these somewhere else are countries that are not negligible countries. I mean, they're the most important population countries and huge countries. So I don't see that this is a stable situation. This is a situation that could change at any time. Yes, I wouldn't be surprised if there is the creation of Asian alternatives to the IMF. So far, I think Rafiq knows better than me. It has been difficult. The rivalry between Japan and China has prevented that from happening after the Asian financial crisis, and that's I would say the Chiang Mai initiative has 3 main countries that have different positions regarding the United States, which is of course China, Japan, and Korea. It's difficult to say, but I would say this is a very unstable situation. And there's another thing. China, for the West, is still free riding the WTO, because for the West, China is not complying with the spirit of the rules of the WTO. They need the multilateral rules for several reasons. First of all, because if digital trade grows and grows, I mean, you cannot do without multilateralism. You cannot replace that with friendshoring, unless you go into an Orwellian world. So I don't believe that the WTO will disappear. And now there's a lot of frustration that the country that profited arguably more of free trade is somehow free riding the WTO, and most of all still pretending that it's a developing country. So any new negotiation at the WTO, or any negotiation that has been going for 20 years, China wants to be treated as a developing country. And look what's happening with fisheries negotiations, in which China is the biggest fishing country in the world, but they still argue that they cannot have the same obligations. They have to have lesser obligations than their advanced economy partners. So that's very frustrating. It cannot go on. It cannot go on. Now, what's the trade-off? I see no trade-off within the agenda of the WTO. And reforming the IMF, accepting it's a zero-sum game for the Europeans and for the Americans. To give more quotas to countries in which they have somehow hostile relations if they don't get something in exchange. And what can they get in exchange at the IMF? I really don't see it.
agree. Rafiq.
Yeah, I think your point, Hector, that Asia is not a monolith. There are different countries in Asia, each with their own views, is an important point. There is some common reaction to, what's happening in WTO and IMF, and geopolitics has come into that. And the common thread is, if I would say there's one common thread, it's an increased caution about the Western world within Asia than there was before the Ukraine war. I think countries like India now are much more likely to have independent policies, in whether it concerns diplomacy or economic policy. You're going to see much more independence there from countries like India. There's frustration in Japan too that its strategic autonomy has been severely curtailed by the U.S. insistence on Japan following the alliance line, and then coming to China, of course, it can't challenge the IMF right now. It just doesn't have the financial capacity. It doesn't have a convertible currency, for example. I mean, many reasons that the IMF in some ways is unique and secure for at least for a long time. However, the enthusiasm with which China will participate in the IMF is much weaker than it was some years ago. Now, coming to the WTO, I think it's far more at risk than the IMF. The reason is the RCEP, CPTPP, and so on, particularly RCEP, are doing really well. And the countries that have benefited largely from it are not just the developing countries in it, but the rich countries. Japan has expressly noted that it has benefited greatly from RCEP because of the rules of origin measure that's within RCEP that makes it much easier for them to export within the RCEP bloc. So, but it's part of the overall trend that I was trying to talk about earlier, which is that there will be strains and stresses in some cases, and I think WTO is probably most at risk. There will be alternatives that will come in, and it's unfortunate where you'll have sort of a world that's not that united anymore, and will come up with the challenge of services that you mentioned. Back to you.
Thanks, Rafiq. Very clear answer. Diego, would you like to ask a question? We have a few minutes.
Sure, thank you, and thank you, Hector and Rafiq, for your presentations. Just a question, the G20, I agree with Hector that probably G20 is the vehicle for this. But I think the next question is, the G20 being a leaders mechanism, it's not an organization, is who specifically within the G20 you see like moving this debate forward? And as of course you're aware, at this point in time with this geopolitical tension, the fragmentation, the G20 is only showing the lowest common denominator. So in a sense, I think for some time, what we can expect from G20 is only some incremental changes to global governance that will, in a way, make the balance of unhappiness a bit more acceptable to all. But I agree that the context is very challenging. But back to my question is, do you see any particular leaders within the G20 advancing this debate? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I can only say that out of the very few leaders that we have in the world sitting at the G20, I think that, well, first of all, I know President Macron is interested in receiving a brief straight from the WTO Director General. This was what she told us meaning a group of members of a group of multilateralism that we met her about a month ago, and she was very clear, saying at that point, and I'm sharing a confidence here. I started discussing with her about, I foreshadowed this that I just said. She's coming from 19th Street. And I said, well, first of all, you are in, the WTO is in this deep trouble because it doesn't have an independent evaluation office. We have been sweeping problems under the carpet until the carpet is so full. And she agreed immediately. And then I said, well, look, the agenda that you have in front of her, because she was complaining that everybody wants to reform the WTO. Everybody wants to reform the WTO, but nobody agrees what the hell reform is. Moreover, I would add, when China hears reform the WTO, what they actually listen is reform China. They're very concerned that, of course, those that want to reform the WTO in the West, say the United States, the EU, what they have in mind mostly is about imposing new rules on subsidies and state-owned enterprises, basically. Which, of course, if we go that way, that's a dead road. I mean, China has to be convinced, persuaded that reforming the WTO is not about imposing on China the Western shareholder governance model. It is not about that. It is about helping all other countries to discern what is the influence of governments in corporate decisions. And this is not just about China. As you know, industrial policies now are everywhere, and governments in the West are subsidizing as they never did before. So to a certain extent, that's an opportunity to bring that discussion there. Now, you're asking me who's the leader. I don't see a leader. That's true. Macron is the only one that has been showing interest in this. Now, maybe Lula could be a next leader. He has just been elected. But Diego, you worked at the G20. You have the answer for this question. I would like to hear what you think, because you have been working and helping. I think you will be working with the Saudis, right? And I don't know if you were working with the Italians as well or with the Indians as well, but you're an expert in this. Can I pass it to him?
Well,
we have just Diego, just a second. Those who want to leave, since we're past a few minutes past, please do, and thank you for being here. We're gonna go on for another 5 minutes because we have a couple more questions, and I'm gonna throw it right back to Diego if he has a comment, and then Rafiq, if you want to say anything about this. Thanks. Yeah. Did you have a comeback, or Rafiq?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think the leadership has to come from either China or the United States. They're not going to listen to anyone else telling them what to do. And given the current toxic state of relations between the two countries, I see the G20 as having a doubtful future itself. Back to you.
Yes, having worked for the G20 myself, it was difficult before, and now it's kind of. I would like to, if okay, get at least one more question. I think Peter was asking a question about praising multilateralism. Peter, are you still with us? If not, I'll go to it's in the chat, so I guess you can answer that in person, but by email. But Jeffrey asked the question, said, Hector, do you know of a close historical precedent for symmetrical reforms in two multilaterals? So here's just a test of whether this has a precedence. Hector?
Sorry, could you ask me the question again?
Do you know of a close historical precedent for symmetrical reforms in two multilateral organizations? No,
I ignore that.
He doesn't. Okay, well, it would be a primer. Yeah, so but I guess that's not an impairment by itself. also because it's actually what Hector explains, that it's going to be easier to reform both because there's going to be like an exchange, quid pro quo in the reforms. So last question here is from Kirayev. Do your reform suggestion require complete depoliticization of both the IMF and the WTO? Can a different solution work, like he's saying, abandon both and use purely technical commercial platforms to facilitate trade and to facilitate payments? I guess this is a, let's go back to the whiteboard kind of suggestion to pre-1944. I don't know, that I'll throw it there if you have any reactions, Hector, but I don't think that's where you were trying to bring us today. Is basically saying they're both very political organizations, and so it's going to be very difficult unless they sort of become less political, let's put it that way.
Well, there's nothing that prevents we from going back to the 40s. But honestly, that's not something I'm trying to propose. And of course, it could always be worse, and we could always do without the WTO and multilateral agreements. You could have trade and barter trade even, but I don't believe we're going that way. I don't believe that the technological advantages that have made the world such a small place can match with can go on without a superstructure of rules that would make that possible. To begin with, because, well, I insist, people forget about every preferential trade agreement is based on rules of origin. There's no preferential trade agreement that doesn't have rules of origin. It's the basis, it's the foundation. You have to be able to discern where a good is coming from. And if, as the world is, we see that exchanges in digital flows are growing far more than exchanges in normal goods. It's not that normal goods will not be part of trade. They're a very important part of trade, and wheat and corn and soybeans and cars will always be wheat, corn, and soybeans. But cars will have a lot of applications they already have. They include a lot of services that are digital services. And then you have all the trade that is digitally delivered, and that is growing enormously. So you need a multilateral platform for that. There's no other way. Unless, of course, I can imagine a world that is totally fractured, say in two friend camps. And so among the friends of the camps, well, you have free flow of data, and then, but that's I don't see that world so close to us, and I'm terrified about the perspective. So I'm not even delving into that.
Thank you, Hector. I agree. And I would like to thank you both for being here today, for giving us a great, refreshing course on the status of multilateralism and ways forward to revamp it, to make it stronger, not weaker, not to go back to the pre-World War II order. We discussed leadership. We have accomplished leaders at the helm of the IMF and the WTO. And hopefully, if there is a political will, as Rafiq said, there will be also an outcome that will make this good developments happen, which are, I guess, in the interest of many countries and not just the superpowers. So the elections coming up in the United States will, of course, be important tea leaves for understanding whether, what you wish for, Hector, what we discussed today is feasible. And with that, I thank you all, and I wish you a great remaining of the day, and I hope to see you again at the webinar series. Thank you so much, Hector. Thank you so much, Rafiq. And thank you, everybody, for being with us a little longer.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks
Take care.
for inviting.